Hello and welcome to the Walk Around podcast powered by JM&A Group. If you are in the automotive business, you have found the place to be. I am one of your hosts, Mark Spoto, joined as always by Elliot Shore.
Hey now.
And today we have with us Elizabeth Krear. Now, Elizabeth is a senior leader at J.D. Power, where she leads activities leveraging data and insights to support the transition to an electrified product portfolio. She knows all things EV. But even more interestingly, before J.D. Power, she has a background in engineering, where she most recently spent time at Stellantis, where she was the Global Planning Director for Jeep Grand Wagoneer. And before that, she was the Chief Engineer for Jeep, Wrangler, and Gladiator SUV vehicles. She has a tremendous background in quality, global manufacturing, powertrain, interior, and she was named one of the top 100 women in North American auto by Automotive News in 2020. You know, if anything with this conversation, Elliot, it is a signal to dealers to say, you have to get ready for EVs because it is here, it is now, and it is only going to continue to grow.
Yeah, Elizabeth presented, really overwhelming data. The alarm bells are going off. It is a 3-alarm fire for dealers to understand that this is not a question of if, it is a question of when, and the time to prepare is now.
And not only that, but we also talked about your favorite food show.
Yes, we'll have to stay tuned to find out what that is.
How about that as a tease? Well, welcome, Elizabeth, to the Walk Around podcast. It is so awesome to have you here. Thanks for making time for us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I think this is our first top 100 women in North America.
And not only that, top 100 women and an engineer.
Right.
So I don't think we've talked to an engineer before on the Walk Around.
And we are recording in March. It is Women's History Month.
Yes.
And we literally it just was International Women's Day. So this is an amazing that you're able to come on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for acknowledging National Women's Day.
Yeah. So, your background, of course, is engineering. We're going to start there, but we're also going to spend some time talking about your experience and your perspective on leading the EV practice at J.D. Power. Mm-hmm. But before we get there, just talk to us a little bit and help our listeners understand your background. How did you get into automotive engineering and the production side of things? Like, where did that start?
Yeah. Well, first, I guess the first question is, how did I get into engineering? And I was one of those kids that was good at math and science, but I didn't really know how to apply it. Like, what do you do with that? You hear about engineering, you don't really know what it is. So I consulted with my dad, and he said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, Dad, I really want to be a businesswoman. So he said, great, then go get your engineering degree. He was wise enough to know that foundation can help you be a decision maker, be able to handle a lot of inputs. So that's how I got into engineering. And then how did I get into the auto industry? For me, that was a natural. Growing up in a suburb of Detroit, I honestly thought the entire marketplace revolved around cars. I love cars. I love advertisements for cars. I like the fact that cars bring with them a lot of new technologies.
Right.
Affect the whole marketplace.
So was your family an engineer? Was your father an engineer?
My dad was an engineer, yes.
Ah, got it. And was your father in the car business?
He was.
Really?
He worked for American Motors. Now, do you even know who that company is?
I've heard
We've
of it.
heard of it.
Can't say I ever experienced their products.
I don't think I've seen a model, but
no.
Well, you have experienced their products because they were they had the Jeep brand. So when Chrysler merged, everything's always called a merger, but in that case, it was more of a buy. When they bought American Motors, that's when the Jeep brand came to Chrysler.
Wow, okay. I did not know that.
See, we learned something every episode.
And then how cool, because later you would then go on to lead engineering for
Jeep Wrangler.
For Jeep Wrangler. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sure hopefully your father got to see that. That must have been a very proud moment, I'm sure.
Yes, he did.
Right?
Yeah.
I would assume so. I mean, that's pretty cool that you followed his advice, one, as a father, and then actually became very successful in what you did.
Right.
So,
Mark and I commiserate about how our kids do not follow our
not
advice
to us at all.
at all.
But maybe eventually.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Well, as they get older, they do. Right.
Yes.
I'm sure your children are very young.
I have a teenager, so
do I.
we'll get there. We'll get there.
One day.
Elizabeth, tell us some of the challenges that you faced in your career as you rose to the leadership position on the engineering side. You mentioned earlier when we were chatting about your position as a leader and in this business. I'm sure you didn't encounter a lot of female engineers along the way. So tell us what that challenge was like.
The biggest challenge for me in my career was when I was responsible for the Ram 1500, and I was at that point the quality executive, and we were launching the new Ram product lines in Warren Truck in Detroit, and then also in Saltillo, Mexico. At that same time, I had middle school children, very pivotal years. And my boss came to me and said, hey, we've got this opportunity to go get your executive MBA program from that Michigan State program, which is a very fast-paced program. So really busy time for me, but I had always wanted to pursue an MBA. So that was the most challenging time because there were three incredibly competing
priorities
that I had to balance.
So how do you maintain that balance?
Back to that, women being in this industry, it's a tough industry to begin with, and then you throw on top of it children and husband and school.
So how did you balance that? Like, what would be advice for women who are struggling to figure out this balance? And really, it's not just women, right? I think it's right. Everybody. But what would be some advice or tips that you learned along the way?
What I did is I took down all the barriers, which is a very different approach than what I see a lot of people do. A lot of people like to compartmentalize and have their family time and have their work time. And then with that MBA program, there's the study time too. But I took down all the barriers. And so I always had my phone on at work and would take my kids' calls. And then I never turned my phone off for work at home. And I situated myself at the kitchen table during those 2 years where when I was home and there was that study work as well as work, I was at the kitchen table and I told my kids, I said, this is where I'm going to be. So if you want to study with me, if you want to talk. So I made myself very present and available, even though I was constantly multitasking.
Wow. And how was your leadership in the organization supportive?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that was a time when we were not virtual, so I would still go to work every day.
Sure.
And the MBA program was all in the evening and then over the weekends. So
that's great.
It was my leadership that recommended me for the program. So they were absolutely supportive.
I mean, how important is it to have leaders you work with that are supportive of different arrangements and flexibility? It's, we had a gentleman on here that was a labor expert, and he described just that, having flexibility in support of your associates.
Yeah, you've talked about qualities of a good boss, or your best boss is about the fact that they care, right? And that they're supportive. So Elizabeth, as an engineer, something we were wondering, the automotive business, as you know, is incredibly competitive.
Yes.
Certainly when it comes to sales and being number one. But how does that translate on the engineering side? Are you, as an engineer, are you looking at what the other guys are doing? Are you comparing yourselves? Like what does that competitive nature look like from an engineer's perspective? Yeah,
from an engineer's perspective, and then I had the opportunity to be the chief engineer on both the Ram 1500 and the Wrangler products, and those are two examples of products that have very much a personality. And I think you see that in the auto industry. Every vehicle line has its own consumer base, has its own features that we're gonna lay down and die for.
Right.
Interesting.
Example, Jeep Wrangler, it will be the most off-road capable vehicle. So that said, though, there's constantly competitors feeding the market. I mean, we really see that in the EV space, but regardless whether it's an EV or an ICE, having that benchmark data is critical. It's mainstream in the auto industry. Number one, there has to be a strategy of what do we want the vehicle to do. Number two, constantly looking at the competitive base, making sure that we're making the right compromises, because there are constantly compromises made.
Right.
There's a cost budget, there's a timing element, and then there's the engineering. So balancing those variables is a constant, and staying true to the features that are the personality of that vehicle.
Yeah, that's great. So as an engineer, or a chief engineer, do you focus on, is it inclusive of the design, the look of the vehicle, which I've always felt is an art? As much as in engineering, to me, it's art. And as it is the feature benefits, when you get down to the nitty gritty of Wrangler is competing with this vehicle, they offer this and this package and this trim, is how do you balance those two, the design elements of the art with the hard, I need this accessory, I need this option. Is that a balance, or does that happen elsewhere in beyond engineering?
No, it's absolutely a balance. It is the role of the chief engineer to sometimes we compare it to a conductor. And so we are keeping everything in sync and in line. So we hold the delivery of the engineering variables. We have to deliver on the engineering, but we also have to deliver on the budget, and we have to deliver on the time. And you're absolutely right. The design, the styling comes from the design studio. Those are extremely talented artists who have their degree in automotive design from some of the top universities in the country. So they have a vision. They set the style.
Gotcha.
And then the engineers have to engineer to that. And are there compromises? Sure. Sometimes a material that maybe a designer picks doesn't pass a sun load test.
Right. Right.
So then we have to go back and negotiate. Well, what are the other, what materials do pass, and then select the one that passes.
Is it a constant back and forth and collaboration between design and engineering? Or at some point, do you just tell the designers, okay, enough, we're going to take it from here and just let us do our thing?
It is a constant collaboration for a period of time. And that period of time is once tools are kicked off, once the supply base has to start making the tools to actually manufacture the parts. You can't go in and change these very high level production tools easily.
Right.
So
that makes
there's
sense.
a good amount of time baked into the process to make sure that all the testing is done and that those hard conversations can be had. And to your point about that's the styling side of it, but there's also the feature side too. So what features is the vehicle going to have? If it's going to have a certain level of autonomous driving, for example, that's a very long lead item. Electric vehicles, very long lead, which powertrain you put in. So, and then of course the features that you mentioned, what kind of convenience features do you want, heated seats, et cetera.
Sure.
So all of that has to be balanced within that time frame before tools are kicked off.
Yeah, it really is like a symphony. I love the way you use that composer. But I do have some questions, and we'll jump maybe pivot a little bit to EVs here, but because actually there's two questions I had in this, and I'll start with probably maybe the easier one. So, recently I read about the Cybertruck that Tesla is allegedly working on. I read about the fact that they are designing it in stainless steel. And it was an interesting article that came out about how that'll never happen. And I'm curious, when you see designs, especially from new EV entrants that are sort of radical, or even Tesla, it comes out with a Cybertruck that's going to be designed in stainless steel. Do you look at that and sort of chuckle and be like, that'll never happen? Or do you look at that with sort of an open mind and say, I wonder how they're going to do that? How do you think about the designs that are coming out, and specifically the Cybertruck, in regards to whether that will actually be a reality?
Right. And we don't know really what our competitors are always doing, but there are sometimes those big leaps that you see, right? With Ford, it was the aluminum body that was new at the time. And you better believe Ram was all over analyzing, is that right for their customer? Is that right for their business model? Is it right for long-term repair? So there's a lot of variables when you change materials that have been in use for so long. But absolutely, I think auto industry always takes competitors very, very seriously.
And so, my other question was, there was another recent article, again, talking about EVs and EV strategy, and it was about Toyota. And it was a really recent article. It was a very fascinating article and they were talking about the engineers had gotten their hands on was it a Model S and they were stunned when they opened the hood at the sort of the simplicity and the genius of the design. And Toyota, world-renowned engineering, world-renowned in terms of their Kaizen and incremental improvements. And for them to see this sort of wow from Tesla, and I don't know if you saw that article, but does that really happen where engineers are decomposing other competitor cars and then actually really get surprised? Like, wow, we've never thought of that.
No, absolutely. Tear downs are commonplace in the auto industry, and especially in two categories. You mentioned Toyota. Toyota is known for their quality, always have been known for their brand loyalty. So absolutely understanding what is Toyota doing is always important. And then these new entrants, you mentioned Tesla and the Cybertruck. I'm sure as soon as the competitors have an opportunity to tear that truck down, that will happen at some time. So
that's got to be a little bit fun. It's important
for engineers to stay curious.
Right.
Very important.
Elizabeth, that's got to be a little bit of a fun job to tear down a competitor's vehicle.
We actually, when I was at Chrysler, we would sometimes do it internally, but there's other companies that do it too, and that you work with them, benchmark companies.
So Elizabeth, this is a good segue into just kind of the EV landscape. So you've got this engineering background. You're now overseeing, the EV practice at JD Power, and you must have visibility into, all the EV models and plans that are happening from an OEM perspective. So, right off the bat, we were looking at some things, and we talk about EVs quite often on the walk around, but one thing we always discuss is adoption and where are consumers' minds at when it comes to EV. Elliot, you were just talking to a group of associates here the other day, and you got some interesting feedback that we're not ready for EVs.
Well, I will tell you, I was talking to a group of associates, and just show of hands, who would buy an EV today? And it was a room of about 10 people, and not one of them raised their hand. Which I thought fascinating, because I raised my hand, right? And but not one of them raised their hand. And it was interesting. And I asked why, right? Like, what's holding you back? I was curious. And for this room, the biggest challenge was range anxiety, and not knowing. It was road trips. That was their specific anxiety around road trips. But to Mark's question, where are we today in consumers' minds and where they are in terms of their adoption of EVs?
That's a big question. All right, so you touched on a lot of things. Let me try to break it down. Number one, we're JD Power. we love talking to customers. That's what we do.
No doubt.
So we survey 2,000 new vehicle shoppers every month. So we're not surveying just mass public. We're surveying people that are in the market in the next 12 months to purchase a vehicle. We also monitor their online behavior. And what we see is a number much higher than what you cited. We see 1 out of every 4 shoppers are very likely to consider an EV for their next purchase.
Interesting.
So that's one. That's what they're telling us they're thinking of doing. But then we also look at adoption. We can look at adoption a number of ways, but let's look at it in a very simple way. Market share.
Sure.
Market share has more than doubled over the past 2 years. It's at about 8.5, and that right now. So 8.5% of all new vehicles sold are EVs.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting about that stat too, which one of your colleagues, Thomas King, pointed out to me a few weeks ago, was that that's a total market share number.
Right.
You look at the segments in which EVs compete, and you narrow that down. So right now you can't really get a full-size pickup truck EV, right? Maybe you can get a Rivian, arguably, but when you look at the segments in which EVs compete, that market share number is way higher. So almost the stat you're saying, would you agree? It's almost misleading in that it's underestimating the amount of true demand out there.
Absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head, and you're talking to the right person with Thomas King, because, you know, we've worked very closely in defining what is the right measure for adoption. And I said market share to you because your audience is probably familiar with that number, and it'll give them kind of a comparative scope. But when you look at the market scope of all the segments out there, as you said, and you think about all the EVs that are out there right now, how much of that scope are we covering? And the answer is only about 30%.
Oh, wow. It's
only about 30%. In the next couple of years, that market scope is going to grow to 70%. So think of it as 70% of new vehicle shoppers will have an EV option available to them that meets their needs, in terms of segment, that meets their needs in terms of brand, in terms of how much money they want to spend. So
that's where I was going to ask you to go next, because, you know, today you see the luxury market, right? You look at the market share of luxury. Tesla is far and away. It's not even close. They're the number one luxury brand by a lot.
Exactly.
And so do you see that 30% to 70%? Do you see that coming in at the lower end of the scale, more affordability as a barrier, and that is being addressed by the manufacturers?
Right. So that 30 to 40 was what's going to be available. Now you talk about the biggest, there's 2 big barriers. You mentioned both of them: affordability and infrastructure.
Sure.
And we are seeing massive moves in affordability. Affordability is not the price of a vehicle. That's a legacy view. In the legacy view, people look at the MSRP, they negotiate a little bit, tax, title, license, out the door you go. They know what they're spending. In the case of an EV, it's important to consider all the variables. And still, people don't know about that federal tax incentive, $7,500. There's a lot of criteria to be eligible for it.
Absolutely.
But the goal of that is to make it eligible to almost everyone. And what we're seeing is that so many vehicles, when you couple that along with state and local incentives, and then the operating costs, the cost to operate an electric vehicle is so much less than a gasoline because the cost of electricity is so much less. So when you put all those things together, we're seeing several vehicles more affordable than their ICE segment counterparts.
Interesting. And that's interesting. And that's the type of data that needs really to be coming out to encourage that mass adoption. I did have a quick question. One of the things we've had other guests talk about barriers. One of the ones that has come up from a practical perspective, I'm curious to get your take on, is how do we improve adoption in urban dwellings? And meaning when you live in an apartment, and maybe you don't have a parking spot, maybe you park on the street, or maybe you park in a parking, you have one spot under your building, and you don't have the right to put a charger in there. And that's it sounds like a very logical barrier. How do we overcome that? How does the industry overcome that barrier, which is a real barrier for a lot of people who don't have garages per se?
Right. So if we break that down, the number, we have the national average, at least based on our data, it's about 33%. And it varies from state to state. Some states people have more ability to charge at home, other states less. But the national average is about 33% don't have a way to charge at home. And that's an important number, because the number of people today that charge at home that own EVs, remember, we're still in the early stage of adoption. Right. 85. So 85% of all people who own EVs have a way to, charge at home.
Sure.
So that 15% that's in public now, if we're going to have mass adoption, at a minimum, it's got to get to 33%, right? For those people that you're talking about. And that's where obviously some of the federal tax incentives are geared towards helping build out the infrastructure. And it's very important to differentiate types of charging here, because there's that level 2 charging, which is, it might be a couple of 2-3 hours to charge your car. So we call that convenience charging. That might be the kind of charging that needs to be in place at restaurants or at movie theaters. Very different from the guy who needs to charge up and go drive 3 miles, wants to charge as fast as possible, which would be a fast charge.
Right.
So that's where we are monitoring really within our infrastructure score, because we measure infrastructure and infrastructure growth. And sadly, our score month over month is deteriorating. It's really not good to begin with, and it's deteriorating. And the reason is because the number of EVs on the road are growing at a faster pace
interesting.
than the public charging. Well, I think we need to watch this very closely the next couple of years. I think a lot of the federal money will be freed up, and all the industries are looking at how do they bring charging into their footprint.
So go ahead. Did you have a follow-up on that?
Well, I was just going to say, we've heard recently about a lot of the infrastructure out there is damaged, or
not in good condition.
You can imagine you're on your last 10 miles of charge, and you show up, you make it to the gas station or the charging station, and it doesn't work. And, there's been quite a few articles about how the maintenance of these chargers is not there yet. Is that a real issue that's out there?
A very real issue. Again, we survey customers, and one of the things we do for public charging is we survey all year long, because people who live in climates like Michigan, could be snowing one day, rain. So we want to get their opinion and their voice on what the public charging sentiment is all year long. And what our data shows is, again, I'm going to give you the national average, and it varies state to state. California is obviously worse because they have an older network than the other states, but about 20% of the time, the customers tell us for some reason or other, they couldn't charge when they attempted to. Could be it didn't read their credit card. It could be that the charger was broken, but it could have been that it was somebody was there, so they couldn't wait, but they couldn't charge when attempting to.
Elizabeth, you mentioned the state of Michigan, and that to me is also another factor in terms of barriers to adoption, because as Elliot was mentioning, we were talking to some folks here, and we're based in Deerfield Beach in Florida. And of course, the threat of hurricanes are present in Florida. So if you're an individual who has to evacuate and be on the road, or let's say a usual occurrence when hurricanes do happen is electricity is out, and what happens there? So how much do those factors are you seeing playing into barriers of adoption in terms of where people are living and their life and what they have to deal with?
Mm-hmm. We're not seeing yet those fringe cases. I think those fringe cases are the things that people talk about, right? The room that you had when
Sure. Yes.
But we're talking to the people who actually own the EVs.
Right.
They've taken the leap in terms of the satisfaction of public charging and ownership. And one of the things that we do see, and I find this statistic remarkable, 96%, and it actually went up from last year. 96% of electric vehicle owners tell us that they will buy an EV again.
Oh, wow. That's a huge stat.
That's a huge stat. Last year it was 94%, and I thought that was high.
Wow.
And it's actually gone up to 96. And you couple that with the fact that this year, the growth in mass market, because you think about the early adopters, the Tesla.
Sure.
They tended to be, higher price class type vehicles. Tesla owns the market, but now we're moving year 2 of mass market choices.
Right.
And the customer base in our study this past year for mass market grew 22%, more than the premium. So now we're starting to see the mass market really start to engage and buy, and yet that I would buy again is still 96%.
Wow.
Well, and that I know JD Power released recently a ownership study that and what was interesting to me, and I got to joke around a little bit here, but I think the Rivian R1T was the highest ranking, and I kind of said to myself, does anyone actually own one of those?
Well, how long has it been really on the road?
How do they have data to actually, that's valid,
right?
To declare that the R1T is the highest ranks highest in ownership, and I guess that's ownership satisfaction. If I'm understanding that correctly?
That's ownership satisfaction, absolutely. And
so maybe you could share a little bit about how that the Rivian ranks so high there.
So the Rivian does very well in appeal. So the satisfaction of an EV, we look at the driving performance. We ask the customers about their quality. We ask them about their home charging experience public. So the ownership, it's more than just the vehicle. It's the vehicle and the experience of owning that vehicle and operating that vehicle.
Gotcha.
And the Rivian does very well in some of the owner appeal, the styling, the performance of the vehicle. They score very well. And we think of it as almost a halo effect. They're so happy just being in that vehicle with some of those attributes that even though they might be sharing the same public network that another vehicle is, because there's not a whole bunch of Rivian charging network out yet, there's this halo effect and their experience is very good.
Yeah, it's an Apple. I think what you're describing was what I would describe as it's an iPhone effect. If you talk to diehard Google phone people, they will tell you that the iPhone is inferior in almost every single way. You talk to anyone who has an iPhone and they would not trade it for the world.
Right.
So interesting. Yeah.
So and in terms of there aren't many out there, we have a minimum threshold in order to be ranked. Our study only showed, a handful of vehicles within the public ranking. there's data on a lot more, but we would never put them in the public ranking because they didn't meet the threshold. So there's enough out there that they met the minimum threshold to be ranked.
Very good. And I'm sure that is the case. I have no doubt.
What were some other interesting takeaways, Elizabeth, from your ownership study?
Yeah, something that we added this year, trucks are entering the market, right? So we know that there's maybe the Tesla truck coming, the Ram Revolution, F-150 Lightning's out there, the R1T. So one of the things that we added to the study this year is trying to understand a little bit more deeply about towing and range, because that's one of the questions that we get from our customers. And a couple of interesting insights. The first one is just general range in general, not necessarily for that special truck market, but just in general. We ask our customers, what is the range at which you do not have to change any of your driving habits or any of your behaviors? And in the mass market, that number is 263 miles.
Wow.
So a far lower range than a lot of vehicles out there.
Yeah. Interesting.
And on the premium side, it's 313.
Huh.
And yet you see vehicles like Lucid coming out with 500 miles range, but yet the customer base is saying, beyond 313, I don't really have to change my driving habits. So that's one thing that I thought was really interesting. The other thing is we probed a little bit more deeply on the truck owners in anticipation of this question, how is range when you're towing a large load? And what we find is that the satisfaction of battery stated range and accuracy of battery stated range was higher among the truck customers who towed than those who did not tow. So again, it's really breaking down that concept of expectation versus what's really happening.
What's needed.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I would even say those numbers sound really high to me in terms of
the mileage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, would you think you would have to change your driving? I mean, my commute to work is less than 30 miles.
Right.
I mean, I would think if it can get me 100 miles, I wouldn't have to change. That's there and back.
That's plenty.
With plenty left over. I wonder what's driving those numbers to be so high in terms of, why they would say such a high number.
Because there are those exceptional cases where maybe you want to drive to visit your child at college.
Good point.
Or, go to mom's house.
So, Elizabeth, clearly sentiment is growing and customers are becoming more and more engaged, and ownership share, all of that is increasing. Mm-hmm. Now let's talk a little bit about it from the dealer perspective. Mm-hmm. If you're advising a dealer, what should they be thinking about? Because we talk to our dealer partners all the time, and you can talk to 5 dealers and get 5 different viewpoints, some ranging from EVs are not on my radar to I got to get my store ready because, and there's so many different opinions, both politically charged and practically charged. Mm-hmm. So what is your advice to a dealer now about EVs?
My advice is to think about how they're going to educate the EV customer. It is a different animal. Number one, educate in terms of the affordability.
Right.
What are the variables? Communicating the variables to be eligible for the tax incentive. There's a lot of rules. We don't have to go to them. If you want to talk about it, we could maybe do it in another it would take a whole session. But there are a lot of rules, but it's easy to break it down. So being able to communicate to the customer, look, this EV, you're eligible for a certain amount of tax credit. 1. 2, also communicating the value proposition of owning the vehicle, that not having to go to a gas station and fill your car up week over week adds up to a lot of savings. So
Right.
address number one, that barrier to adoption of affordability. Number two, address the barrier to adoption of charging. Help the customer. Most companies offer apps.
Right.
Learn how to use the app so that you can show the customer, look, here's an app. You're going to be able to find charging locations. Yeah, many automakers offer free charging. So helping the customers with getting set up, whether it's charging at home or charging in public, is also important. And I think that traditional dealerships are in a perfect sweet spot right now. And EVs are coming. We saw market share grow. We know it's going to triple, more than triple in the next few years. We see mass market vehicles starting to really enter the market at a much faster pace. So it's a matter of time before these dealerships are going to have that mix.
Yeah.
And thinking now about where are they going to charge the vehicles for those customers? Are they going to offer charging to those customers long term? Do they want to have some kind of value proposition for them? Are they going to charge for it, or will they have a coffee shop in their dealership?
Right.
Something that the customers can do while charging if they go that route.
Yeah, it's and I would say that's a great lesson, and great advice, not just for EVs, but we talk
any vehicles. Educate your customer.
Be helpful.
Yeah.
Right. Just be helpful to your customer. Right. Don't think of them as the adversary. Think of them as, and we talk about all the time on this, how dealers can stay relevant in this world of direct to consumer sales, and try, some OEMs and traditional, direct to consumer OEMs literally cutting the dealer out. And one of the themes that we hear consistently from industry leaders like yourself is, like what you just said, help the customer. They are buying a complex product. Be helpful for them. And that will lead to your success, which is, I think, great advice.
Yeah. So, Elizabeth, we've now reached a point in the conversation where I think it's time to hear some of Elliot's insights and advice.
This is going to be a tough one.
This is going to be a tough one because Elizabeth has a great deal of knowledge.
We heard a lot of data. She's an engineer, math and science background.
I'm
intimidated.
So we are going to do a sure thing with you, Elizabeth. And if you don't know, Elliot's here is going to give you some hot takes, and then you can help us decide, is it a sure thing or not a sure thing?
Yes. I think, so we'll start off on an engineering note. And I'm not an engineer, never will ever claim to be, and no one will ever mistake me for one. But I do have opinions around what the engineering marvels of the 21st and 22nd century now.
Automotive.
Right?
You're not going.
Yes, we're not going to go. That'd be a lot. We have to take bridges and tunnels and skyscrapers into account. No, that's way beyond our capacity.
Yes.
But a few for me come to mind in terms of the greatest automotive engineering marvels of all time. Clearly the Model T. Right. You could argue the original Tesla Model S. The Prius comes to mind for me. Really, the GM, the EV6 in a way, even though it's considered one of the biggest flops of all time. Also, to me, an engineering marvel. I think of the Hummer, the original Humvee, and as an engineering marvel. However, to me, there's one vehicle that stands out above all the rest. And I believe that the DeLorean is the number one engineering marvel vehicle of all time. Sure thing or not a sure thing?
You're going to probably laugh at me, but I'm going to say a sure thing.
Wow.
Because
I wasn't expecting that.
While you were talking, that's the vehicle that came to mind.
Wow. Look at that.
Interesting.
DeLorean was ahead of their time. They did a lot of unique things and people bought them. They actually got off the ground.
Wow.
Hard to be in this barrier of entry. It's difficult.
Wow.
Wait, it didn't actually take you to another year, did it? Did I miss that?
No.
No. Okay,
No,
good.
no. But I will tell you that's a gift for me.
That is.
I 100% thought you would disagree with me.
I don't think he's ever started 1 for 1.
No, never.
In terms of his hot takes.
That means it's got to be.
Way I don't have to pick another one.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Okay.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So let's put our future hats on, right? Let's put our 50-year into the future hats on for a second. The question becomes, in 50 years, what is the dominant propulsion system for vehicles? And, there's a lot of opinions here. You talk to different manufacturers, you're going to get a lot of different opinions. But I happen to believe, and maybe, yes, I do have Toyota roots, but I happen to believe that Toyota has this one right. And it's a sure thing that hydrogen propulsion will be the prominent, and I would say dominant? The majority and dominant propulsion system in 50 years from today. It will be hydrogen. Sure thing or not a sure thing?
I'm so curious what Elizabeth says about this. She's already shaking her head.
Because there's a mix.
That could be an answer.
Okay, so
we do take cards.
Are you giving him half credit there? Or?
I'm giving half. That absolutely is a technology that hasn't seen its day yet in the industry at any kind of mass levels. And there's still technologies that are looking at that, especially for larger vehicles. And 50 years is a long time. I think we're going to have a mix of propulsion systems.
Elizabeth, is there anything out there, or maybe it's not even out there, anything that's sort of not even on the radar of a propulsion system that could be a viable one? Even in your, in your imagination, is there anything that could be viable in 50 years?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that. My whole family.
Tell us offline so then we can invest.
Well, I mean, honestly, going back to question one, right? Well, now I'm invoking Back to the Future, not exactly DeLorean, but the DeLorean was powered by what? Nuclear.
That's right. Was it?
Well, it was electric. Actually, no, it was electrical, right?
It was electrical.
Right?
Because the electricity,
1.1 gigawatts.
The strike of the electricity powered Marty into the future.
But I always thought it was nuclear. Was it nuclear or
it was the flux
in the movie,
capacitor.
I thought it was electricity that powered.
It was the flux capacitor, remember?
Right, but doesn't he need to get plutonium? Isn't plutonium nuclear?
Who knows?
I don't know. Clearly.
Let's move on.
Okay.
You're mixing up Superman now, I think, with Back to the Future.
We're giving you a half credit on that one.
Okay.
1.5 for 2.
All right. Well, 1.5 for 2.
Here we go.
I definitely think this one is a.
Well, no, we don't know.
We'll see.
I think you have potential here.
So we know that Mark was kind enough to share, and we hope you don't mind sharing, that you're a bit of a foodie. Is that correct, Elizabeth? That you enjoy cooking, you're a foodie, all of that. And so Mark and I started talking in our prep about, there's a lot of great cooking shows out there. And so, I have an opinion on
what a shock
on what the best cooking shows of all time are. Some may say it's Top Chef. Some may say it's Iron Chef. Mark, I know, I'm a
big fan of Beat Bobby Flay. I think that's a cool show.
Beat Bobby Flay. But to me, Guide at Home, and I never pronounce her name right. Giada, sorry. Uh-huh. But to me, there is a clear winner here. And it has to be Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives is the best cooking show of all time. Sure thing or not a sure thing?
Not a sure thing. That's an easy one.
What is your favorite?
I like the Final Chef Table.
Okay.
A bit of a competition. It's like Chef's Table where it's very high end. You can learn from watching it, but there's still a competition twist to it.
All right. I'll have to check one out. Where can I find that one?
I think we watched it on Netflix.
Oh, okay. I'll have to check that one out because I do enjoy I can't cook, but I enjoy watching other people cook.
Yes. Well, Elizabeth, this has been a fantastic conversation. We have learned a lot, clearly.
Yes.
And
I'm sure our audience has as
listeners,
well.
I think there are a lot of takeaways, especially if you're a dealer. It is time to prepare yourself
it's coming
for EVs to become the majority of what you sell.
Right. We heard it tripling in market share in a few short years here.
Right. So, Elizabeth, we can't thank you enough for the time and sharing with us your experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening, whether you are a dealer owner, GM, sales or service, or just starting your automotive career. You are sure to pick up some insights.
Oh, that's very slick. I like what you did there.
Appreciate it.
Well, in all seriousness, thank you for listening. We would really love if you could go on and leave us a review. Go ahead and hit subscribe. We're on YouTube for the video, Spotify, Apple, anywhere you can find a podcast, you can find us. We greatly appreciate you listening. Thank you, guys.